Fredric Jameson S. Sartre, The Origins of a Style, provides a profound examination of Sartre's unique literary style, deeply intertwined with his existential philosophy. The book explores the emergence of Sartre's narrative technique, considering it in light of broader intellectual currents and personal contexts. Jameson's work aims to elucidate how Sartre's philosophical ideas find expression in his literary form and how his style reflects his existentialist concerns, particularly around freedom, responsibility, and the self. In doing so, Jameson presents a critical assessment of Sartre's style, not only as a vehicle for his ideas, but as an inseparable aspect of the ideas themselves. The central thesis of Jameson's work revolves around the inseparability of Sartre's philosophical content from his literary form. For Jameson, Sartre's style is not merely a tool to express existentialism, but is itself a manifestation of existentialist thought. This conception pushes against the idea of style as ornamental or secondary to the substance of philosophical discourse. Sartre's use of language, narrative structure, and descriptive detail reflects his existential preoccupation with the nature of human freedom, alienation, and the burden of choice. The book traces how Sartre's literary approach evolves in response to his philosophical development, particularly through his shift from earlier works like Nausea to later texts, such as Being and Nothingness. One of the key aspects Jameson focuses on is the role of alienation in Sartre's style. Sartre's early works, such as Nausea, embody a narrative style marked by estrangement, both in the protagonist's consciousness and in the way the external world is depicted. This alienation is not simply thematic, but woven into the very fabric of Sartre's prose. Jameson points out how Sartre's fragmented descriptions, his use of disjointed temporal sequences, and the deliberate ambiguity in his language create a sense of estrangement that mirrors the existentialist view of the human condition. In Nausea, for example, Sartre's protagonist Roquentin experiences the world as a series of disconnected and often grotesque phenomena, a stylistic choice that underscores the existential experience of absurdity and contingency. Jameson also discusses Sartre's philosophical engagement with freedom, which manifests stylistically in his rejection of traditional narrative closure. For Sartre, freedom is a central tenet of existentialism, but it is also a source of anxiety and ambiguity. In his literary works, this philosophical stance is reflected in his refusal to offer easy resolutions or definitive moral judgments. His characters often find themselves caught in situations where their freedom leads to paralysis rather than action, and this sense of uncertainty is mirrored in the open-endedness of Sartre's narratives. For Jameson, Sartre's style embodies the existential belief in radical freedom, where the lack of a determined path or clear conclusion reflects the human experience of perpetual choice and its accompanying dread. Another critical component of Sartre's style, as analyzed by Jameson, is his focus on the body and the material world. Sartre's descriptions are often visceral, emphasizing the physicality of human existence and the way in which individuals are inescapably bound to the world of things. Jameson suggests that Sartre's detailed, almost obsessive focus on the body and objects reflects his existential concern with the tension between consciousness and the external world. The material world is portrayed not as a neutral backdrop to human action, but as something that imposes itself upon consciousness, often in ways that challenge the subject's autonomy and freedom. This tension between the subject and the object world becomes a recurring stylistic feature in Sartre's work, particularly in his use of descriptive passages that interrupt or displace narrative flow to remind readers of the brute facticity of existence. Jameson highlights Sartre's use of the gaze as a stylistic and philosophical motif. Sartre's existentialist theory of the look, developed in Being and Nothingness, posits that the gaze of the other is a source of objectification and alienation. In his literary works, Sartre often explores this dynamic through his characters' interactions and internal monologues. The gaze becomes a central narrative device, capturing the tension between self and other, subject and object. Jameson emphasizes how Sartre's stylistic representation of the gaze, through shifts in narrative perspective, the fragmentation of dialogue, and the detailed focus on facial expressions and body language reinforces his philosophical ideas about intersubjectivity and the struggle for self-definition in the presence of others. Jameson also delves into Sartre's rejection of psychological depth in his characters, arguing that this stylistic choice reflects Sartre's existentialist rejection of the Freudian model of the unconscious. For Sartre, the self is not a stable, internally coherent entity, shaped by hidden psychological forces, but a project that is constantly being redefined through action and choice. In his literary works, Sartre avoids delving into his characters' inner lives in the way that traditional realist novels do. Instead, his characters are often defined by their actions and external circumstances. Jameson suggests that this stylistic choice reflects Sartre's philosophical commitment to the idea of existence preceding essence. His characters are not determined by pre-existing psychological traits, but are defined by the choices they make in response to their situations. Jameson's exploration of Sartre's literary style also considers the broader historical and intellectual context in which Sartre was writing. Sartre's engagement with Marxism, phenomenology, and psychoanalysis all play a role in shaping his approach to narrative and description. Jameson situates Sartre's style within the larger currents of modernist literature, particularly its focus on fragmentation, ambiguity, and the rejection of conventional narrative forms. However, Jameson argues that Sartre's existentialist commitments push him beyond the purely formal concerns of modernism. His style is always in the service of his philosophical project. Sartre's use of fragmented time sequences, unreliable narrators, and shifts in narrative perspective are not merely experimental techniques, but are employed to express his existentialist ideas about freedom, bad faith, and the absurdity of the human condition. In examining Sartre's later works, Jameson notes a shift in his style that corresponds to his evolving philosophical concerns. As Sartre becomes more engaged with Marxist thought and the question of social responsibility, his literary style begins to reflect this shift. Jameson observes that Sartre's later works, such as The Roads to Freedom display a more explicit concern with collective experience and historical forces, moving away from the radical individualism of his earlier existentialist works. This shift is reflected in a narrative style that becomes more concerned with social and political structures, as well as with the interaction between individual agency and historical determinism.